The morning sunlight spilled over the small rural town of Meadowbrook, casting long shadows across the dew-kissed fields. At the edge of the town, a modest house stood resolutely, surrounded by rows of vibrant roses and towering oak trees that swayed gently in the breeze. This was the home of Ethan Grayson, a 92-year-old World War II veteran known as a living legend in the community. To the neighbors, Ethan was a quiet but deeply respected figure, often seen tending his garden or raising the American flag every morning, a ritual he'd kept alive for decades. Ethan's days were a blend of discipline and serenity, rooted in the values he carried from his time in the Pacific Theater. His home was not just a house. It was a haven of memories. On the mantelpiece sat a faded photograph of a young Ethan in his Navy uniform, flanked by his comrades, many of whom never made it back home. A hand-carved wooden plaque on the wall bore the words, "To serve and protect." This was Ethan's motto, etched into his soul. But today felt different. As Ethan adjusted the tattered gloves his late wife Margaret had gifted him on their 40th anniversary, he noticed something unusual. The morning chorus of birds was absent, replaced by an ominous hum in the distance. Dismissing it as an overactive imagination, Ethan continued his morning routine. He slowly walked down his gravel path, his cane tapping rhythmically against the stones, and raised the flag with the reverence of a soldier honoring fallen comrades. "Good morning, Mr. Grayson," called out Lila, the little girl from next door, her voice cheerful as she rode past on her bicycle. "Good morning, Lila," Ethan replied with a smile, though his gaze lingered toward the forested edge of town. A faint roar, like distant thunder, echoed again. Inside Ethan's house, every corner told a story. The leather armchair by the window was where he'd sat with Margaret on countless evenings, sipping tea and sharing dreams. Now it was where he reminisced, sometimes aloud, as if Margaret might still answer. The garden outside had been her pride, a sanctuary they built together after the war. Roses of every shade bloomed vibrantly, their colors a stark contrast to the dark memories Ethan carried from the battlefield. He paused by the old oak tree where a swing once hung, swaying with the laughter of children who had grown up and moved away. Though Ethan and Margaret never had kids of their own, they were surrogate grandparents to every child in Meadowbrook. The neighborhood adored him, often dropping by with baked goods or just to hear one of his famous war stories. Yet behind the warmth of his smile lay a profound emptiness. Ethan often found solace in his rituals, in the orderliness of life. To him, the flag, the roses, and the quiet mornings were more than routine. They were anchors in a world that had become increasingly unpredictable. Later that day, Ethan decided to inspect the edge of his property, a dense line of trees that separated his land from a nearby forest. The hum he'd heard earlier had grown louder, now unmistakably the sound of engines. As he stepped closer, the ground vibrated faintly beneath his boots. Peering through the brush, Ethan froze. A group of men in rugged gear roared past on massive off-road vehicles, tearing through the undergrowth like it was their personal playground. Tires dug deep into the soil, uprooting saplings and leaving behind a trail of destruction. These weren't the local teens joyriding. They were part of a larger, more organized group. The logo on their ATVs, a snarling wolf surrounded by jagged tire tracks, suggested they weren't just here for fun. Ethan's sharp eyes caught sight of something else. Beyond the forest, near the town's farmland, more vehicles gathered in a makeshift camp. Large tarps, toolkits, and what appeared to be crates of beer hinted at something more than casual riding. "These fools don't know what they're messing with," Ethan muttered under his breath, gripping the cane tighter. As he returned home, the faint hum of the engines was now a roar, and a sense of foreboding settled over him. Ethan felt it in his bones. Something was coming. Something that would challenge not just him, but the entire town. That evening, Ethan visited his closest friend, Walter Brooks, another veteran who lived nearby. Walter, though younger by a few years, shared Ethan's concerns. "Ethan," Walter said gravely after listening to the account, "I've heard of these off-road groups before. They move into small towns, tear up the land, and leave the locals to clean up the mess. Sometimes it gets worse. Harassment, even violence." Ethan nodded, his jaw tightening. "They've already started on the forest. If they touch the farmland or the gardens, it'll be war." Walter placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "We're not the men we used to be, but we've still got some fight left. If it comes to that, you know I've got your back." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the town in hues of gold and crimson, Ethan sat on his porch, gazing at the forest line. The distant roars of engines grew louder, and with them, an unsettling certainty. His peaceful life, his beloved community, and the land he'd nurtured with Margaret were under threat. But Ethan Grayson wasn't one to back down. He'd faced enemies before, on the battlefield and in life, and this time would be no different. The camera lingers on Ethan's determined expression as he picks up an old, faded photograph of himself in his uniform, whispering, "Not on my watch." If this story of courage and resilience inspires you, don't forget to hit like, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories. Let's keep honoring the spirit of heroes like Ethan Grayson. Stay tuned for what happens next. Trust me, you don't want to miss it. The next morning, the tranquility of Meadowbrook was shattered. A thunderous roar, like an unrelenting storm, echoed through the town. From his porch, Ethan Grayson saw it, a convoy of off-road vehicles tearing down the gravel road. Dust rose in thick clouds, clinging to the air as the massive tires of ATVs and dirt bikes churned up the earth. Ethan's grip tightened on the porch railing as he watched the convoy pass by, heading toward the forest at the edge of town. Ethan's neighbors began stepping out of their homes, confusion and concern etched on their faces. Children clung to their parents, startled by the noise, while a few of the braver ones peeked out from behind fences. The convoy came to a halt near the abandoned farmland bordering the forest, a patch of land that had been unused since its owner, an elderly farmer, had moved into assisted living. As the vehicles circled like predators, the riders dismounted. They were a mix of men and women in rugged gear, their faces obscured by helmets and bandanas. The leader, a burly man with a wolf insignia emblazoned across his jacket, barked orders. Ethan, with his sharp veteran's instinct, knew immediately these people weren't just thrill seekers. They were organized, and they intended to stay. Over the next few days, the group set up a makeshift camp on the farmland. Large tarps stretched between trees, serving as shelters. Generators hummed as floodlights illuminated their operation late into the night. The once quiet evenings of Meadowbrook were now filled with the relentless roar of engines, punctuated by raucous laughter and shouting. The damage began almost immediately. Deep tire ruts scarred the forest paths where the group held illegal races. Saplings were uprooted, and patches of wildflowers, once a favorite spot for families to picnic, were trampled beyond recognition. The group's activities weren't confined to the forest. Their vehicles often spilled into the surrounding farmlands, crushing crops and destroying fences. For the townspeople, the disruption was more than just an annoyance. It was an invasion. Lila's father, Tom, tried to confront the group one morning after finding his chicken coop destroyed. He returned shaken, his hands trembling, as he told Ethan about the leader's warning. "They laughed at me," Tom said, his voice quivering with anger and fear. "Told me I'd regret it if I called the police. One of them even crushed my toolbox under his tires as they left." Ethan listened silently, his jaw clenched. He'd seen this kind of intimidation before, in places far from Meadowbrook, where bullies thought their power could go unchecked. Ethan's own confrontation came a few days later. It started with something small, an empty beer can tossed onto his lawn. Then came the tire tracks, marring the carefully tended path he'd maintained for decades. But the breaking point was when Ethan found his garden vandalized. His rose bushes, Margaret's pride and joy, had been trampled, their vibrant petals scattered like fallen soldiers. Ethan knelt in the dirt, his gnarled hands trembling as he picked up the remains of a once perfect rose. His eyes stung, not just from the dust, but from the memories. Margaret had planted those roses with him, their roots intertwined with their shared history. The destruction felt like a personal attack, not just on his garden, but on the life he and Margaret had built together. As Ethan stood, a rumble approached. 3 ATVs roared into his driveway, the riders laughing as they circled like vultures. The leader dismounted, a smirk on his face. "Nice setup you got here, old man," he sneered, kicking at the edge of the garden. "Shame it's in our way." Ethan straightened, his back aching but his resolve unshaken. "This isn't your land," he said evenly. "You have no right to be here." The leader laughed, a cruel sound that echoed across the quiet neighborhood. "What are you going to do about it? Call the cops? Good luck with that. We don't scare easy." As the group revved their engines and sped off, tearing up more of Ethan's lawn, he watched them go, his fists clenched at his sides. He wasn't scared, but he was angry. Ethan wasn't the only one targeted. Over the next week, the off-road group escalated their intimidation tactics. Families stopped letting their children play outside. The local grocer closed early after the riders stormed in, demanding free snacks and leaving a trail of destruction. Even the town's small police department seemed overwhelmed, their sporadic visits doing little to deter the group. At a hastily organized town meeting, emotions ran high. Tom spoke first, his voice filled with frustration. "We can't just let them take over. This is our home and they're destroying it." "But what can we do?" asked Mrs. Carter, the elderly schoolteacher. "There are too many and they don't care about the law." Ethan stood silently in the corner, listening. The fear in his neighbors' voices was palpable, and it stirred something deep within him. He had seen this before, in war-torn villages where people felt powerless against invaders. But he had also seen how a united community could stand strong, even against impossible odds. That night, Ethan sat in his armchair, the house eerily quiet around him. On the table beside him lay an old leather-bound journal, a collection of names and numbers from his time in the service. Many of those names had long since faded into memory, but a few were still as sharp as the day they were written. Ethan flipped through the pages until he found it, a name he hadn't spoken aloud in years. Charlie Hudson, a fellow veteran who had once told Ethan, "If you ever need anything, brother, you call me." Picking up the phone, Ethan hesitated for only a moment before dialing. The line crackled as it connected. "Hudson," a deep voice answered on the other end. "Charlie," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling within him. "I need your help." The silence that followed was brief but heavy. "Where do you need me?" Charlie finally asked. "Meadowbrook," Ethan replied, "and bring the others." As Ethan hung up, a sense of calm washed over him. He wasn't alone. Not in this fight, not ever. Looking out the window, he saw the faint glow of the off-road campfires in the distance. They thought they owned the town, but they were about to learn a lesson in true courage and unity. The once peaceful days in Meadowbrook turned into a blur of tension and disruption. The off-road group's presence grew more invasive by the day. What had started as occasional races through the forest evolved into a full-scale occupation of the abandoned farmland. Trucks and ATVs thundered through the area day and night, flattening crops, scaring livestock, and leaving the town's residents increasingly afraid to step outside. For Ethan Grayson, the tipping point came one evening just before sunset. As he sat on his porch, the soft golden light reflecting off the polished brass of the American flagpole, The silence was shattered by the roar of approaching engines. Ethan's eyes narrowed as two ATVs sped across his lawn, their thick tires digging deep ruts into the grass. The riders laughed wildly, one of them tossing an empty beer can onto Ethan's pristine walkway before disappearing into the forest. When the noise faded, Ethan walked to the garden, his cane sinking slightly into the torn earth. What he saw made his heart sink. His beloved rose bushes, which he and his late wife Margaret had spent decades nurturing, lay crushed beneath deep tire tracks. The vibrant red and pink blossoms were scattered like confetti, the fragile stems twisted and broken. Ethan knelt down, his weathered hands trembling as he picked up a damaged bloom. The scent of the crushed petals brought back vivid memories. Margaret kneeling beside him, her laughter ringing through the air as she teased him for planting the bushes in perfectly straight lines. "You're not in the Navy anymore, Ethan," she joked. "Let them grow wild and free." He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, the pain of the loss mingling with a growing determination. Margaret wouldn't have let bullies like this destroy what they had built together, and neither would he. The next morning, Ethan's resolve was tested. He was working to repair the garden when a group of 3 off-roaders arrived on his property. Their leader, a towering man with a wolf emblem stitched onto his jacket, dismounted his ATV and leaned casually against the fence. "Mornin', old man," he drawled, his tone mocking. "Fixin' up your little flower patch?" Ethan straightened slowly, his back aching, but his gaze steady. "This is private property," he said firmly. "You have no business here." The leader smirked and stepped closer, deliberately crushing a stray rose petal beneath his heavy boot. "You think you can stop us? You and what army?" Ethan's hands tightened around his cane, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he held the man's gaze, his voice calm but unyielding. "I've faced bigger threats than you in my lifetime, son, and I didn't back down then either." The tension was palpable. For a moment, it seemed the leader might push further, but one of his companions tugged at his arm. "Come on, man," he muttered. "Let's go." The group eventually left, but not before the leader spat on the ground near Ethan's feet. "You've been warned, old man," he said, revving his engine and speeding off. Word of Ethan's confrontation spread quickly through Meadowbrook. Some neighbors praised his courage, while others begged him to be more careful. "You're just one man, Ethan," Tom said during a tense visit to his home. "These people don't play fair. What if they come back? What if they do worse?" Ethan's response was simple but firm. "If we don't stand up to them, who will?" Despite his words, Ethan could see the fear in his neighbor's eyes. The off-road group's antics were growing bolder. They had started vandalizing fences, stealing tools, and even blocking the main road into town with their vehicles, forcing residents to take long detours. For Ethan, it wasn't just about his own property, it was about the community he loved. The little girl next door, Lila, had stopped riding her bike because the noise scared her. Her father, Tom, had lost an entire section of crops to the group's reckless driving, and Ethan himself could no longer enjoy the quiet evenings on his porch without the constant roar of engines in the distance. The breaking point came one night when Ethan woke to the sound of shattering glass. Grabbing his cane, he hurried to the window and saw flames licking at the edge of his garden. A group of off-roaders had set fire to a pile of dried leaves near his roses, the smoke curling into the night sky. Ethan's heart pounded as he grabbed a hose and rushed outside, dousing the flames before they could spread. As he stood in the damp, smoky remains of his garden, Ethan realized that this wasn't just about intimidation anymore. It was about destruction. The off-road group was trying to scare him into submission. But instead of fear, Ethan felt something else rise within him, anger, tempered by a deep sense of duty. The next morning, Ethan made his way to the community center, where a small group of neighbors had gathered to discuss the situation. The mood was grim, but Ethan's presence brought a sense of quiet strength. They think they can take what they want because they have the numbers and the machines, Ethan said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. But we have something they don't, a reason to fight. This is our home, our land, and I'll be damned if I let them destroy it. After the meeting, Ethan returned home and pulled out his old address book. Flipping through the yellowed pages, he found a name that made him pause. Captain Samuel Sam Briggs, a fellow veteran who had served with him during the war. Sam had gone on to lead a group of veterans who specialized in community outreach and protection. Ethan picked up the phone and dialed. The line rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Sam, Ethan said, his voice filled with a mix of relief and determination. It's Ethan Grayson. I need your help. Ethan? Sam's voice brightened with recognition. What's going on? Ethan quickly explained the situation, detailing the off-road group's actions and the impact they were having on the community. There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Sam spoke again. We'll be there, he said simply, and we'll bring the team. As Ethan hung up, he felt a sense of hope for the first time in weeks. Reinforcements were coming, not just any reinforcements, but men and women who understood what it meant to protect something worth fighting for. That evening, as the sun set over Meadowbrook, Ethan stood by his flagpole, watching the colors of the sky shift from orange to deep purple. The roar of the off-road vehicles continued in the distance, but this time, Ethan didn't feel alone. He knew that soon the tide would turn. The camera lingers on Ethan's determined expression as he raises the flag once more, its stars and stripes glowing in the fading light. Behind him, the faint sound of distant engines grows louder. Not the disruptive roar of the off-roaders, but the steady, purposeful hum of vehicles driven by people who knew the true meaning of service and sacrifice. Ethan's battle was far from over, but the fight for Meadowbrook had only just begun. Ethan Grayson stood at the edge of his property, his old Navy jacket draped over his shoulders. The morning sun cut through the mist that lingered over the fields, casting long shadows across the torn earth of his once beautiful garden. Behind him, the stars and stripes fluttered proudly on the newly repaired flagpole, a symbol of resilience in the face of chaos. But Ethan's thoughts weren't on the flag or the garden. They were on the reinforcements he'd called, his brothers and sisters in arms, who'd shared trenches, battlefields, and the scars of war, were now rallying to help him protect something equally precious. Home. It started quietly. A rusted old Jeep pulled into Ethan's driveway later that afternoon, its tires crunching over gravel. Behind the wheel was Sam Briggs, Ethan's wartime companion. His weathered face broke into a grin as he climbed out, his broad shoulders still carrying the strength of the Marine Corps despite his years. "Ethan," Sam greeted, extending a hand. "It's been too long." "Not long enough, considering the circumstances," Ethan replied, shaking his hand firmly. Sam wasn't alone. Over the next few hours, vehicles of all kinds began arriving. Old trucks, motorcycles, and even a few vintage military jeeps. Each one carried a veteran who had answered the call. Men and women of all ages, some with prosthetic limbs, others wearing patches from their units, filled Ethan's yard. Their presence was a powerful reminder that the bonds, forged in service, never truly faded. One of the newcomers, a wiry woman named Angela Ironheart Rains, stepped forward. Her sharp eyes scanned the property as if assessing a battlefield. She was a Gulf War veteran with a reputation for strategic thinking. "This is where we make our stand?" she asked, a hint of a smile tugging at her lips. Ethan nodded. "It's not Normandy, but it's ours." As night fell, the veterans gathered in Ethan's living room, the hum of quiet conversation filling the space. A large map of Meadowbrook was spread across the coffee table, with markers indicating the off-roaders' camp, their frequent routes, and areas of destruction. Angela and Sam took the lead, their voices calm and authoritative, as they outlined the plan. "We're not here to start a war," Sam said, his voice steady, "but we're not going to let them run wild either. This is about protecting the community, not provoking them." Angela added, "We'll use strategy, not brute force. Show them what real discipline looks like." The plan was simple but effective. They would block off access points to the forest and farmland, ensuring the off-roaders couldn't expand their activities further. A few veterans would confront the group directly, delivering a clear message. The people of Meadowbrook wouldn't be intimidated any longer. But it wasn't just about defense. Angela had a few surprises in mind, calculated risks designed to disrupt the group's operations without crossing any lines. Word of the veterans' arrival spread quickly through Meadowbrook, and the town rallied behind them. Neighbors brought food and supplies, while others offered tools and resources. Lila and her father, Tom, arrived with a basket of fresh vegetables, their gratitude evident in their expressions. "Thank you for helping us," Tom said, his voice thick with emotion. "We didn't know what else to do." Ethan placed a reassuring hand on Tom's shoulder. "You did what you could. Now let us handle the rest." One particularly touching moment came when Mrs. Carter, the elderly schoolteacher, arrived with a group of children from the town. She had spent the afternoon teaching them to fold small paper flags, each one bearing a handwritten note of thanks. As the children handed the flags to the veterans, there were tears in more than a few eyes. "This is why we fight," Angela murmured, holding one of the delicate flags in her hands. The next day, the veterans put their plan into action. At dawn, they stationed themselves at key points along the forest's edge, their vehicles forming a line of defense. The sight was striking. Veterans in worn military jackets, standing shoulder to shoulder, their faces resolute. It was a silent declaration of their intent. When the off-road group arrived, their convoy of ATVs and trucks roared down the road as usual, but they skidded to a halt when they saw the blockade. The leader, the same man who had taunted Ethan days earlier, dismounted his ATV and swaggered toward the line of veterans. "What's this?" he demanded, his tone dripping with mockery. "A retirement home field trip?" Sam stepped forward, his posture calm but commanding. "We're here to protect this community. Turn around and leave, or face the consequences." The leader laughed, a harsh grating sound. "You think you can stop us? This land doesn't belong to you." Angela stepped forward, her voice cold and precise. "No, but it doesn't belong to you either. And we have no problem calling every legal authority we know to shut you down. That's a promise, not a threat." The off-roaders exchanged glances, their bravado faltering in the face of such unwavering resolve. Still, the leader wasn't ready to back down. "We'll see about that," he sneered, gesturing for his group to leave. As the convoy roared away, Ethan turned to the others. "They'll be back," he said quietly. Angela nodded. "Let them. We're ready." That night, the veterans prepared for retaliation. True to Ethan's prediction, the off-road group returned, this time with more vehicles and a clear intent to intimidate. They circled the veterans' blockade, revving their engines and shouting insults. But the veterans didn't flinch. They stood firm, their silence more powerful than any threat. The confrontation escalated when one of the off-roaders tried to ram an ATV through the blockade. A veteran named Mark Steele Dawson, a towering figure with a prosthetic leg, stepped forward and placed a hand on the vehicle's handlebars, stopping it cold. "Not another inch," Mark said, his voice low and menacing. The off-roader hesitated, then backed down. The tension was palpable, but the veterans held their ground. Slowly, the off-roaders retreated, their bravado shattered. The following morning, Meadowbrook woke to a sight that brought hope to the town. The veterans had begun repairing the damage caused by the off-roaders. Together with the townspeople, they worked tirelessly to restore the farmland and forest. The sight of young children planting trees alongside seasoned veterans was a poignant reminder of what could be achieved through unity. Ethan stood at the edge of the field, watching the scene unfold. A sense of pride swelled within him. It wasn't just about protecting the land. It was about showing the next generation the value of standing together, of fighting for what was right. As the sun set over Meadowbrook, Ethan looked toward the horizon, where the forest now stood silent and unbroken. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of hope. Together, they were stronger, and the off-road group was about to learn that the hard way. The town of Meadowbrook buzzed with nervous energy as whispers spread like wildfire. Tonight would be the night. The off-road group, their pride bruised by the veterans' defiance, had announced their plans for a grand show of force. With loud, taunting roars of their engines echoing through the valley, they sent an unmistakable message. They were coming back, and this time they intended to make the veterans pay. That afternoon, Ethan Grayson sat at his kitchen table, polishing a small brass Navy whistle. It was old, battered, and worn, a relic from his days in the Pacific Theater. To him, it was more than a whistle. It was a symbol of leadership, a reminder of the moments he had rallied men in the chaos of war. The whistle gleamed in the afternoon light as Ethan set it down carefully beside a photograph of his late wife, Margaret. The sharp knock on the door pulled Ethan from his thoughts. It was Tom, his young neighbor, his face pale and anxious. "Ethan," Tom began, stepping inside. "I've heard talk. The off-roaders. They're bringing reinforcements. Twice as many vehicles. They said they'll tear through the town tonight." Ethan nodded slowly, the calm in his expression unnerving Tom. We knew this was coming," Ethan said, "but we're ready." Tom looked incredulous. "Ready? You're just a handful of veterans. These guys, there's no telling what they're capable of." Ethan placed a steady hand on Tom's shoulder. "There's more to winning a fight than numbers, Tom. Courage, unity, and purpose. Those count for far more." As evening fell, the veterans gathered at Ethan's property, their movements quiet and purposeful. Angela Ironheart Rains directed the team like a seasoned general, mapping out the final details of their strategy. "We're not looking for violence," Angela reminded the group. "But if they push us, we push back with the tools we know best, precision and discipline." The veterans divided into teams. Some would man the blockade at the forest entrance, while others would patrol the farmland and the edges of the town. A smaller group, including Angela and Sam Briggs, would be stationed at the center of the action, a makeshift command post on Ethan's front lawn. Ethan stood apart from the group, watching the preparations with a quiet resolve. He carried Margaret's rose-pitted gloves in his jacket pocket, a small, personal reminder of what he was fighting for. The sight of his fellow veterans, their camaraderie and determination undiminished by the years, filled him with pride. The first sound came just after sunset, the distant rumble of engines. It was deeper, louder than before, and as it grew closer, the air seemed to vibrate with the sheer force of it. The off-roaders appeared on the horizon like a swarm, their headlights cutting through the darkness in sharp beams. At the forest blockade, Mark Steele Dawson and a team of veterans stood firm. They had fortified the barricade with heavy logs and sandbags, making it impassable for the ATVs. As the convoy approached, Mark stepped forward, his towering figure silhouetted against the headlights. "Turn back," he commanded, his voice calm but unwavering. The off-roaders skidded to a stop, their engines snarling. The leader, his wolf-emblazoned jacket gleaming in the light, dismounted and approached the line of veterans. "You think this little show of yours will stop us?" he sneered. "You're old, outnumbered, and out of your league." Mark's expression didn't waver. "We've been outnumbered before, and we've never lost." The leader laughed, but there was an edge of uncertainty in his voice. "We'll see about that." The off-roaders spread out, their vehicles circling the veterans' position like wolves stalking prey. From his front lawn, Ethan could see the chaos unfolding. His sharp eyes caught the glint of something in the leader's hand, a crowbar perhaps, or a wrench. It didn't matter. The intent was clear. Angela's voice crackled through the radio. "They're trying to provoke us. Hold your ground. Don't give them an excuse." The tension was palpable as the off-roaders revved their engines, the noise drowning out the quiet resolve of the veterans. One rider, younger and more impulsive, surged forward, slamming his ATV into the barricade. The vehicle recoiled, the tires spinning in vain against the heavy logs. Mark stepped forward, his prosthetic leg thudding against the ground. Without a word, he reached down, grabbed the front of the ATV, and pushed it back with a single powerful motion. The young rider looked up at him, stunned, before backing away. Just as the standoff seemed ready to erupt, the situation took an unexpected turn. From the forest came another sound. Different, distinct. It was the low rumble of military vehicles. The off-roaders turned in confusion as headlights appeared on the horizon, this time from the direction of the town. Ethan allowed himself a small smile. He recognized the sound instantly. The Veterans Motorcade, a group of local and regional veterans who had heard about the situation and rallied to join the fight. The motorcade rolled in like a wave, their vehicles gleaming with military insignias and American flags. They didn't rev their engines or shout. They didn't need to. Their sheer presence, the silent, disciplined precision of their arrival, spoke louder than words. The leader of the off-roaders hesitated, his bravado crumbling in the face of the reinforcements. He turned to his group, trying to rally them, but the younger riders were visibly shaken. They had signed up for reckless fun, not a confrontation with battle-hardened veterans. Ethan stepped forward, his cane tapping against the ground as he approached the leader. The crowd parted, and all eyes turned to the old man who had started it all. "You've done enough damage," Ethan said, his voice carrying a weight that silenced even the engines. "This town has fought harder battles than you can imagine. It won't fall to a bunch of cowards tearing up land that doesn't belong to them." The leader glared at him but said nothing. The silence stretched, broken only by the distant chirp of crickets. Angela spoke next, her voice calm but commanding. "You have two choices. Pack up and leave, or stay and face the consequences, not just from us, but from every legal authority we can call on. Believe me, we have friends in every department that matters." The leader looked around, realizing the tide had turned. Slowly, he nodded. "Fine, we're leaving. But don't think this is over." Angela's eyes narrowed. "It is if you're smart." One by one, the off-roaders mounted their vehicles and left, their engines roaring into the distance. The veterans didn't cheer or celebrate. They simply stood in quiet solidarity, watching until the last taillight disappeared over the horizon. The next morning, Ethan walked through his garden, inspecting the damage. Though the scars on the land were deep, the spirit of the town was unbroken. Neighbors joined the veterans to begin the cleanup, their collective effort a testament to the strength of unity. Ethan paused by the rose bushes, kneeling to replant one of the stems that had been torn from the ground. As he worked, a small hand reached down beside him. Leela, her face bright with determination. "Can I help Grandpa Ethan?" she asked. Ethan smiled, his heart swelling with gratitude. "Of course, sweetheart. Let's fix this together." And so, under the morning sun, the people of Meadowbrook began to rebuild. Not just their land, but the bonds that made their town unshakable. The fight had been hard, but it had proven one thing beyond doubt. Courage and unity could withstand even the darkest storms. The night after the off-road group departed, the town of Meadowbrook exhaled a collective sigh of relief. For weeks, the roar of engines and the threat of destruction had hung over the community like a storm cloud. Now, silence reigned, peaceful and heavy, as if the land itself was catching its breath. Ethan Grayson sat on his porch, the stars and stripes swaying gently above him in the night breeze. His face was calm, but his mind churned with memories of the confrontation. Victory, though necessary, had come at a cost. His garden still bore the scars of the invasion, and many of his neighbors were shaken by the events. Yet amidst the quiet, Ethan felt a sense of pride. Not for himself, but for the resilience of his community and the unwavering strength of his fellow veterans. While the townspeople began to rebuild, the leader of the off-road group, Nick Wolf Carrick, sat in a dimly lit warehouse on the outskirts of town. The remnants of his crew surrounded him, their bravado extinguished after the encounter with the veterans. Wolf's pride was wounded, and his temper flared as he replayed the events in his mind. How could they have been overpowered by a group of retirees? His hands clenched into fists as he paced the room, the sound of his boots echoing against the concrete walls. "We can't let them win," one of his men muttered, breaking the tense silence. Wolf stopped and turned, his eyes narrowing. "They haven't won. Not yet." But even as he said the words, doubt crept in. The veterans had exposed the group's weaknesses, not just their lack of discipline, but their inability to stand against a united community. Wolf's gang wasn't prepared for another confrontation, and deep down, he knew it. The real battle, he realized, wasn't one he could fight with engines and bravado. Back in Meadowbrook, the morning sun brought the first glimmers of hope. Neighbors who had been too afraid to step outside during the off-roaders' reign began venturing out, offering shy smiles and hesitant greetings. At Ethan's home, a small crowd gathered to thank him and the veterans for their courage. Among them was Lila's father, Tom. His voice broke as he addressed the group, his gratitude spilling over in raw emotion. "We owe you more than we can say," Tom began, his hands shaking as he held his daughter close. "You didn't just stand up for your own land. You stood up for all of us, for our kids, for our future. I didn't know what to do before, but you showed us that we don't have to be afraid." His words were met with nods and murmurs of agreement. For many, the veterans' stand had been a turning point, reigniting a sense of courage that fear had nearly extinguished. Later that day, as Ethan worked in his garden, a shadow fell across the rose bushes. He looked up to see a figure standing at the edge of his property. It was Wolf. Ethan's first instinct was to reach for his cane, but he held back, studying the man's face. There was no sign of the swagger or mockery that had defined him during their earlier encounters. Instead, Wolf's shoulders sagged, and his expression was filled with something Ethan hadn't expected: regret. "Mr. Grayson," Wolf began, his voice rough but steady, "I came to apologize." Ethan straightened, his gaze sharp but not unkind. "Apologize? For what? Destroying my garden? Scaring my neighbors? Or thinking you could bully a town into submission?" Wolf flinched but didn't look away. For all of it, he admitted. "I thought we were just having fun, tearing up dirt, pushing boundaries, but I didn't see what we were really doing. Not until that night." Ethan's silence was heavy, and Wolf rushed to fill it. "I've never met people like you before. You and your friends. You don't just stand up for yourselves, you stand up for everyone. I want to make it right." Ethan regarded him for a long moment, then nodded toward the broken rose bushes. "If you're serious about making it right, start here, and bring your friends." The next day, something extraordinary happened. Wolf and several members of his crew returned, this time not with ATVs, but with shovels, rakes, and wheelbarrows. Under Ethan's watchful eye, they began repairing the damage they had caused. For hours they worked in silence, their heads bowed as they replanted roses, repaired fences, and cleared debris. The sight of the former adversaries working side by side with the townspeople was almost surreal. Lila watched from her front yard, her wide eyes filled with wonder. "Hey, helping now?" she asked to Ethan. Ethan nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Sometimes people just need a chance to change." As the work progressed, the veterans joined in, their camaraderie infusing the labor with a sense of purpose. By evening, the garden was nearly restored, and the farmland showed signs of renewal. That evening, as the town gathered for a community potluck to celebrate the day's progress, Wolf approached Ethan again. This time, he held something in his hands, a small wooden box. "I found this," Wolf said, his voice hesitant, "when we were tearing up the forest. I think it belonged to you." Ethan opened the box to find a medal inside, a Navy cross, tarnished but still gleaming faintly in the firelight. His breath caught as he stared at the medal, his mind flashing back to the day it had been awarded. It had been missing for years, lost in the chaos of moving and rebuilding after Margaret's passing. "I thought it was gone," Ethan whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Wolf shifted awkwardly. I'm sorry for everything, Mr. Grayson. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I wanted you to have this back." Ethan looked up, his eyes meeting Wolf's. For the first time, he saw not an adversary, but a young man searching for redemption. He reached out and clasped Wolf's shoulder. "Forgiveness isn't mine to give," Ethan said softly. "But change, that's something you can choose." Over the next few weeks, Meadowbrook transformed. The off-roaders disbanded their camp and left, while Wolf and a few others stayed behind, determined to make amends. Under Angela's guidance, they helped the veterans and the townspeople turn the abandoned farmland into a community garden, complete with walking paths and picnic tables. The centerpiece of the garden was a small memorial, a stone engraved with the words, "To those who serve and protect, in war and in peace." Beneath it, a row of newly planted roses bloomed, their vibrant colors a symbol of renewal and hope. For Ethan, the garden was more than just a project. It was a legacy. As he watched Lila and her friends play near the roses, he felt a deep sense of peace. Margaret would have loved this, he thought. She always believed in second chances. The story of Meadowbrook didn't end with the defeat of the off-roaders. It became something greater, a testament to the power of courage, unity, and redemption. And at the heart of it all was Ethan Grayson, the quiet veteran whose strength had reminded an entire town and even his enemies of what it meant to stand together. As the sun set over the town, Ethan sat on his porch, his Navy cross resting on the table beside him. The flag above him fluttered gently in the breeze, and for the first time in weeks, the air was filled not with the roar of engines, but with the sound of laughter and hope. The weeks following the showdown were filled with an energy Meadowbrook hadn't seen in years. The community, once burdened by fear, now buzzed with hope and renewal. The scars left by the off-roaders began to fade, not just from the land, but also from the hearts of the townspeople. Yet, for Ethan Grayson and the veterans, the journey wasn't over. The fight had united the town, but healing was still a delicate process. One morning, as Ethan tended to the final patches of his garden, he noticed Lila lingering at the edge of his yard. Her bike, once left abandoned during the off-roaders' rain, gleamed in the sunlight as she pushed it hesitantly. "Good morning, Lila," Ethan called, his voice warm and welcoming. "Good morning, Grandpa Ethan," she replied, her voice timid. "Can I ride my bike again? Is it safe now?" Ethan straightened, his eyes softening. He walked over and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Yes, sweetheart, it's safe. We're all here to make sure of that." With a wide smile, Lila climbed onto her bike and began pedaling down the road. Her laughter filled the air, a sound that had been absent for far too long. Ethan watched her with a mix of pride and quiet determination. Protecting that laughter, that innocence, was what had made every sacrifice worthwhile. Meanwhile, Wolf, the former leader of the off-road group, had become a surprising figure in the town's recovery. Under Angela's mentorship, he threw himself into the work, repairing fences, planting trees, and even helping rebuild the playground that had been damaged during the off-roaders' occupation. One day, as Wolf replaced a broken swing, he overheard a group of children talking about Ethan. "Grandpa Ethan is so brave," one boy said, He scared all those bad guys away." Wolf paused, the words hitting him harder than he expected. He had once been the bad guy, and yet here he was, trying to undo the harm he'd caused. Later that day, he approached Ethan, his face a mix of humility and resolve. "Mr. Grayson," Wolf began, his voice steady, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about change." Ethan looked up from his garden, studying Wolf with those sharp, knowing eyes. "And I want to do more. Not just fix what I broke, but really contribute. I don't know where to start, but I want to try." Ethan's face softened into a rare smile. "Good. Change doesn't come easy, but it's worth it. Start small, stay steady, and you'll get there." The veterans, inspired by Ethan's unwavering dedication, decided to honor him in a way that would last for generations. Angela spearheaded the project, enlisting both townspeople and veterans to create a new flagpole in the center of Meadowbrook. This wasn't just any flagpole. It was designed as a permanent monument, surrounded by plaques bearing the names of every veteran in the community and a simple but powerful inscription: "For courage and unity." The dedication ceremony was set for the first clear Saturday morning. As the day approached, the town worked together to prepare. Wolf and his remaining crew planted a ring of roses around the monument, a nod to Ethan's cherished garden. Lila and her friends painted signs and decorations, while Angela coordinated a small parade featuring the veterans' motorcade. The morning of the ceremony was perfect. Blue skies, warm sunlight, and a gentle breeze. The entire town gathered in the square, their faces filled with anticipation. At the center stood the new monument, its flagpole gleaming, the roses surrounding it in full bloom. Ethan, wearing his navy jacket and holding Margaret's gloves in his hands, was escorted to the front by Lila and Tom. As the crowd parted to make way for him, a hush fell over the square. Angela stepped forward to speak. "Today we honor more than just one man. We honor a legacy of courage, resilience, and the power of community. Ethan Grayson didn't just fight for his home. He inspired all of us to stand together, to protect what matters, and to believe in the strength of unity." She turned to Ethan, her voice softening. "Ethan, this monument is for you, but it's also for all of us. It's a reminder of what you've taught us, that no matter how dark the storm, we can weather it together." Ethan's eyes glistened as the crowd broke into applause. He stood tall, his hand resting on the flagpole as the American flag was raised. The sight of the stars and stripes billowing against the clear sky brought tears to many eyes, a symbol of victory not just over the off-roaders, but over fear itself. As the ceremony continued, Ethan found himself surrounded by neighbors, veterans, and even Wolf. One by one, they shared stories, laughter, and quiet moments of gratitude. Lila presented him with a small bouquet of roses she had picked herself, her face glowing with admiration. "This is for you, Grandpa Ethan," she said, "because you're our hero." Ethan knelt to accept the flowers, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Lila, but the real heroes are all of us. We did this together." As the crowd began to disperse, Wolf approached Ethan with a small, wrapped package. "I know I've done a lot of harm," Wolf said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "But I wanted to give you something. A symbol of what I've learned from you." Ethan unwrapped the package to find a handcrafted wooden carving of a rose, its petals detailed with intricate precision. At its base was an inscription, "In honor of growth and change." Ethan ran his fingers over the carving, his expression softening. "It's beautiful," he said quietly. "Thank you." Wolf nodded, his gaze steady. "Thank you, Mr. Grayson, for everything." As the day came to an end, Meadowbrook felt renewed. The scars of the past had not been erased, but they had been transformed into something stronger, something beautiful. The town square, now anchored by its monument, had become a gathering place for laughter, hope, and connection. For Ethan, the journey was more than just a victory. It was a reminder of what Margaret had always believed, that even in the darkest times, people could find their way back to each other. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan sat on his porch watching the light play across the roses. He held the wooden carving in his hands, a quiet smile on his face. Margaret would have been proud, he thought, of him, of the town, of everyone who had come together to make Meadowbrook whole again. And as the stars began to appear in the night sky, Ethan whispered softly to himself, "We've won. Not just the battle, but the heart of what matters most." The following months brought a new era to Meadowbrook. The battle against the off-roaders became a distant memory, but the unity it inspired continued to grow stronger. The community, once fractured and fearful, had become a shining example of resilience and cooperation. Ethan Grayson's quiet leadership had transformed not just his neighbors, but the very soul of the town. The newly completed Meadowbrook Veterans and Community Garden was thriving. Rows of vegetables, bright wildflowers, and Margaret's favorite roses bloomed vibrantly in the center of what had once been trampled earth. Families gathered here regularly for picnics, children played freely, and the veterans often shared their stories with the younger generation. At the heart of the garden stood the monument, erected in Ethan's honor. Each day, Ethan would walk the short distance from his home to the flagpole, raising the American flag just as he had every morning since the end of the war. Only now, he was never alone. Veterans, townspeople, and even former off-roaders joined him in the ceremony, their presence a testament to the lasting impact of his courage. One particularly touching moment came when Wolf, the former leader of the off-road group, brought his young nephew to meet Ethan. The boy, no older than 10, listened intently as Ethan recounted stories of his time in the Navy. When the story ended, the boy saluted Ethan with wide eyes and said, "I want to be brave like you one day." Ethan chuckled, his voice warm. Bravery doesn't always mean standing on a battlefield. Sometimes it's about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. For Ethan, life found a new rhythm. His mornings were spent in the garden, his afternoons on the porch, and his evenings in quiet reflection. The town had given him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since Margaret's passing. One day, as he walked through the garden, he noticed Lila kneeling by a patch of roses. She had planted them with her father in honor of Margaret and cared for them diligently. "These are for her, aren't they?" Lila asked softly, her small hands brushing the petals. Ethan nodded, his throat tightening. "She would have loved them, Lila. Thank you." "Ah," the girl smiled, her eyes bright. "She'd be proud of you too, Grandpa Ethan." Those words stayed with him long after Lila had gone home. They weren't just about Margaret. They were about the life he'd built, the battles he'd fought, and the peace he'd helped restore. As a symbol of the town's rebirth, Meadowbrook decided to host an annual Festival of Unity. The first festival drew visitors from nearby towns, eager to see the transformation that had been widely reported in local news. The event featured live music, food stalls, and a small parade led by the veterans. Ethan was the guest of honor, riding at the front of the parade in a vintage military jeep alongside Angela and Sam. The townspeople lined the streets, cheering and waving flags. Wolf, now a regular member of the community, manned a booth raising funds for a new children's playground, his face alight with genuine joy as he interacted with the crowd. As the parade reached the community garden, Ethan stood to address the crowd. His voice carried over the sea of faces, filled with gratitude and quiet determination. "This town has faced its share of challenges," he began, "but what I've seen here is proof of something greater than people come together. When they stand for each other, there's nothing they can't overcome. Meadowbrook isn't just a town, it's a family, and I'm proud to call it home." The applause that followed was thunderous, echoing across the fields. That evening, Ethan returned to his porch, the sounds of the festival still faintly audible in the distance. He sat quietly, the cool night air brushing against his face. On the small table beside him lay Margaret's gloves, and the wooden rose carving Wolf had given him, a simple yet profound reminder of how far they had all come. Ethan reached for a small, weathered journal he kept in his jacket pocket. Flipping through its pages, he found an old photograph of himself and Margaret, taken not long after the war. He smiled wistfully, tracing her face with his finger. "I think we did good, Margaret," he whispered. "The town is in good hands now." The stars above seemed to twinkle in agreement, their light casting a serene glow over the garden. As the camera pulls away, the image of Ethan sitting peacefully on his porch fades into the backdrop of Meadowbrook, a town transformed by courage, unity, and the unwavering spirit of one quiet veteran. If this story inspired you, what would you have done in Ethan's shoes? How can we all take small steps to stand up for our communities and protect what matters most? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit like, share this story with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more incredible tales of courage, resilience, and hope. Together, we can keep these stories alive and inspire a brighter future for all.